Devil May Cry birthed its own genre. Very few games or series get to claim that. Even fewer are still getting better with age, and Devil May Cry has been going for 20 years strong with only an occasional misfire. That's something that's well worth celebrating, and I think Devil May Cry 5 is the perfect celebration of what an awesome legacy everybody involved built. It's the first mainline series entry in 11 years, and it's fantastic. Hideaki Itsuno talked a big game about how this was going to exceed expectations. Obviously, no developer is going to go out and try to deflate the hype for the game that they're promoting, so of course he said it was going to exceed expectations. But for my money, he was right. It's not just good, it's the most fun I've ever had with a Devil May Cry game. Every stop was pulled out. The menagerie of enemies really make the most of each of the 3 playable characters' movesets, and this game features some of the most spectacular bosses that I've ever seen in Devil May Cry. It's gorgeous, it's the most mechanically deep DMC has ever been, it's smooth as a pane of glass, and the playable characters and their incredibly varied arsenals really seal the deal. So first you've got Nero returning from DMC4, but he's been given a visual overhaul, and his personality is more distinct now, and his moveset from the last game is more or less completely intact, and they've just built upon that. This time, instead of his Devil Buster, he gets a series of mechanical arms that he can cycle through, and each one of them does something completely different, and they're all really, really cool. And my favorite out of all of them, I think, is Punchline. It's a rocket fist that you can just sick on enemies, and it'll keep them occupied, and that's fun by itself. But also, you can charge up this devastating uppercut with it, and my favorite part is Tony Hawk's Pro Punchline. So if you land different tricks by enemies, it'll count as a hit. You can combo with your punchline tricks. It's so cool. And since he's the through line of the series, Dante is back with some of my favorite new weapons for him ever, and a new mechanic that I'm not going to spoil, but which is long overdue. I am for sure going to talk about Balrog, though. It's his new capoeira-inspired fist weapon. It rules. And then there is my favorite new Dante weapon, which was foreshadowed back in the Devil May Cry 3 cutscene. It's a whole motorcycle, and it splits into twin greatswords. These are really fun toys to play with. And then finally, there's V. Brand new to the game, but also something brand new to the genre of stylish action. A summoner character, a frail goth boy with a stylish cane who reads William Blake poetry during fights while he commands a bunch of familiars. They nail him, and his summons, who are all callbacks to the original DMC. With the addition of V, Devil May Cry, a series which created its own genre, shows that it's still a pioneer. This game is a love letter to the series and its biggest evolution. Video games have been part of my life for literally as far back as I can remember. I've played and seen so much that it's hard not to lose the magic just a little bit, just a little over time. That spark of picking up a new game and having no idea what's even possible. It makes you feel like anything is possible when you don't know what the boundaries actually look like. But as you play more and you learn more about development and the constraints behind making games and the trends that shape them, it in turn shapes your expectations. Those boundaries start becoming more defined. That's why I think really highly of Baba Is You. It's a puzzle game that's silly and it's joyous, and one that makes me giggle constantly because so many of the puzzle solutions almost double as punchlines. It's ostensibly a block-pushing puzzle game, but the real magic is how inventive it gets with that basic idea of pushing things around until you can reach a designated solution. It requires a tremendous amount of lateral thinking in addition to the logical thinking you typically associate with this kind of puzzle game. Because some of the blocks that you're pushing around are actually words, and when you join the words together or pull them apart, it rewrites the rules of the game. Like, let's take Baba for a second. Baba is this cute little white fluff ball. In most of the levels, it starts out that Baba is you, meaning you are in control of Baba. But that isn't a constant. Like if you replace Baba with Wall to create the sentence, Wall is you, and gain control of the walls in the level. I feel extremely lucky that this didn't slip under my radar because it's something that I've never seen before. And it charmed me so completely that it brought a lot of wonder back and reinvigorated my sense that this medium really does have so much more potential to do incredible things, that there are vast horizons left to be explored. Weird fiction is a genre that I fell in love with as a kid when I discovered H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe. Their prose was dense and it was challenging, but it was also lyrical, and the images they conjured in my head were so vivid. And the ideas, I really only knew horror for either kids' horror literature like Goosebumps or slasher movies at the extreme opposite end of the spectrum. So the style, the atmosphere, and the ideas of the strange, the cosmically uncaring, not to mention all of the cool and unsettling monsters, it really lit my imagination up and inspired a really deep, long-lasting fondness. Then I got to fall in love with it a second time as an adult with authors who are distinctly not Lovecraftian, and who, in many cases, are responding to the pernicious bigotry that informed his work. Authors like Jeff Vandermeer and China Mieville. They're part of a movement in weird fiction called the New Weird that is equal parts postmodern retooling of genre fiction and extrapolations of the weird fiction ideas that I've always found fascinating. And all of this with a hefty dose of surrealism to boot. Controlled by Remedy is a strong addition to the genre, taking direct influences from Vandermeer's own Authority, as well as the SCP Foundation and House of Leaves. It's uncanny and strange, and inside the churning, impossible concrete of the oldest house lies incredibly relevant and pointed themes about surveillance, authoritarianism, and the normalization of brutality. It's a game where space contorts freely in spectacular ways. It's got Remedy's polished gunplay with a bunch of cool paranatural abilities, and a thick atmosphere that just draws you further and further into this labyrinth of oddities. It's a game where you can visit an extraplanar void that's dominated by a cyclopean inverted black pyramid called the Board, and the Board talks to you in slashes that turn everything into a double entendre, and it makes discerning its motives really difficult. And then the Board endows you with a gun called the Service Weapon and makes you the director of a government bureau, then sends you off to do what is in its best interest. So suffice to say, I think pretty highly of the themes that this game tackles, and I also really like the storytelling, along with the incredible moments of visual imagination. Most of all, I love that it is an earnest and compelling shot at bringing the new weird into games. I already knew I loved Slay the Spire since it was in early access in 2018. When it came out in January of 2019, I was dead certain that it was going to be my game of the year, and I was almost right, but put a pin in that. So Slay the Spire is not my game of the year, but just barely. I'm pretty sure that it is my Desert Island game though, because I could play this whenever, wherever, forever. I have put so much time into this, and I can't see myself getting sick of it. So the conceit of Slay the Spire is that it's a turn-based card game roguelike. These are already a few of my favorite things. You pick a class, you start with a few cards, and you ascend a spire, one floor at a time. Each floor can have things like a shop, a treasure chest, or a fight, and then a boss at the very top of the stage. You get to pick one card from an assortment of 3 randomized ones after fights. And then there are also relics that give you passive benefits which can be game-changing. The cards, classes, and relics allow for an incredible number of ways to viably build your deck, and the strategy of how you build your deck for a roguelike setting in which there are so many randomized elements and things that you cannot account for ahead of time That is ridiculously compelling to me. It's why it's stayed so fresh. Your strategy has to be dynamic. You have to roll with the punches, which is one of the most fun things about the game. Every class has a huge number of cards and unique relics, which opens up a litany of possible ways to build your deck through different gimmicks and themes. I've had runs with the Silent where I had half a dozen copies of a card called Noxious Fumes, which envelops you in a choking, poisonous miasma that stacks up a poison debuff on enemies and slowly grinds them down over time. It turned my strategy into one that I wasn't initially going to pursue, but because I had so many of these cards just presented to me, I went with it. And I won fights based on attrition, because I kept just stacking poison up on enemies passively at the end of every turn. So I just defended and I let this prolific stink cloud thin the enemies out. By the end, I didn't even have offensive cards in my deck anymore. It was just slow and plotting, but also kind of hilarious to pull off and have it work so well. It turned me into the Horseman of Pestilence, and it just happened because I rolled with what I was given and I leaned into that turn. There are so many ways to break the game too if you just let yourself be flexible. Strategy in Slay the Spire is something that you sculpt from whatever random block of marble you're given, and the trick is that you're never left wanting if you're clever and selective, and I adore that. Disco Elysium is a classically styled detective RPG, and it's one of the most remarkable, enthralling games that I have had the pleasure of playing ever. It has a sense of humor that can laugh in the face of the morose. It's all rendered in this beautiful, expressionist watercolor style, and the writing is razor sharp. In fact, it is very easily a high benchmark for all games writing, and something that I hope more writers aspire to when crafting the narratives for their games. And there are tons and tons of ways to develop as a character that also changes not only how you solve the central murder mystery, but more importantly, how you introspect, and how the depths of your different modes of introspection can color themes that often lean pretty raw and bleak. The game also doesn't cop out, no pun intended, on exploring the nature of police and the power they wield. In fact, you can become a fascist, and the story will judge you, but it also offers an incisive lens into how many cops wield their authority and their power and their monopoly on violence. Revachol, the game's world, is one battered and scarred by a snuffed-out communist revolution. The main setting of Disco Elysium is the small impoverished town of St. Martinez, laid low by shelling and subsequent neglect and corruption. It is one of the most vividly realized settings that I've ever seen in any work of fiction, with a sheer density of history and culture that makes it feel lived in and real. And it's all handled with sensitivity so that the bleakness is never totally cynical, and the abundance of gallows humor never really crosses over into being edgy. And that's thanks to what is a really apparent wellspring of compassion for the afflicted. And also, even though it really can get down low to show the depths of human misery and self-destruction, it isn't a grim slog. I mean, part of what I did was become a part-time cryptozoologist to hunt down cryptids which may or may not even exist, and try to convince my partner that the supernatural is real. I was an art cop who helped set up a trance club in an abandoned church. The game can go dark, but it's also not completely self-serious. There's also plenty of earnestness and good old-fashioned catharsis. Like before when I mentioned how you can become a fascist, well, one of the roads down that path leads through this hulking racist who loves to talk about his advanced race theory and his superior genetic haplogroup, and he's got a phrenology chart tattooed across his shaved skull. He is grotesque. And yeah, you can choose to be grotesque too. Alternatively, you can spin kick him like a god of martial arts. One of my favorite things about the game is how its stellar writing is infused into and supported by the role-playing mechanics. Like how your attributes are not just stats influencing the dice rolls and skill checks, they're presented as characters with their own discrete personalities. There are passive skill checks that are happening under the hood constantly during conversations. And if you pass, like, let's say an encyclopedia check, your encyclopedia skill might chime in with a tidbit. Sometimes it's useful and relevant, and sometimes it is an inane fun fact. And sometimes it'll just overload you with those dry fun facts that aren't relevant. Like it's preening almost. Or sometimes like it's nervous and it doesn't know what else to do, so it just starts spitting things out at you. And then electrochemistry might butt in and tell you about how the guy you're talking to seems like he knows where to get some speed, and wouldn't you just love to do some speed right now? Oh look, there's a pool of whiskey sitting on that dirty countertop, go lap it up. You can't solve this case sober. One of my favorites is drama, which helps you do things like really sell an elaborate lie. And it really wants you to answer and behave like a thespian, with a dramatic flair to everything. And it calls you my liege and sire constantly. There are 24 of these skills, and they all talk to you, and they are all really cool. And I didn't even talk about some of the more out there ones like Inland Empire, which has to do with the enormity of your soul. It's a game where there's a mechanic called the Thought Cabinet, and it turns the act of thinking into a game verb that you engage with, that you do. And it's so cool. It is a game with a lot of text, a lot of dialogue, a lot of inner dialogue, and it all sings and creates a beautiful harmony. Disco Elysium spends considerable time romanticizing a moment in time that was like a supernova, wanting to recapture it in its radiant heat. The name itself is evocative of the flash in the pan symbolism that is disco, something that burned brilliantly until it was abruptly snuffed out. That's disco, that's your detective, that's the world of Disco Elysium that I was fully absorbed in by the very end. And that's my game of the year.